Well, this morning, I want you to listen to an astounding statistic. In a recent study of the religious life of younger Americans, nearly 9 out of 10 young adults, 87% of non-Christian 20-somethings believe that to be a Christian, to be a follower of Jesus Christ, is to be judgmental. Nearly 9 out of 10 young outsiders said that the term judgmental accurately describes present-day Christianity. So to put this in practical terms, when you and I introduce ourselves to a 20-something neighbor and we mention our faith, chances are he or she will think of us as judgmental. Well, whether or not Christians really are judgmental, that's the perception that people have of us. So it's pretty important that you and I get to the bottom of judging and understanding what Jesus means when he teaches his followers to judge not. The key, I think, is recognizing that the word judge can be used in 2 different ways in Scripture. Sometimes judge is used to speak of judging between 2 things, the act of differentiating and discerning. That's why you and I talk about judging between right and wrong, good and evil, the things that we ought to do and the things that we ought not to do. But this kind of judgment, this sense of discernment, deciding what we should do and shouldn't do, testing the spirits to see which are from God, is not what Jesus is commanding us to avoid. New Testament scholar F.F. Bruce explains it in this way: judgment is an ambiguous word in Greek as in English. It may mean exercising a proper discernment, or it may mean sitting in judgment on people, or even condemning them. In other words, judgment has 2 meanings. It can mean discernment between good and evil, right and wrong, or it can mean condemnation. Judgment as condemnation is what Jesus is prohibiting. And Jesus makes it all the more clear in the second half of the verse 37. Judge not, and you will not be judged. Condemn not, and you will not be condemned. Jesus is simply saying the same thing in 2 different ways. Jesus is calling on his disciples, his followers, not to condemn people, not to pass final judgment, not to declare others as less worthy of God's or our love and acceptance. And what a shocking wake-up call this was. In the context in which Jesus was speaking, in the culture of first century Palestine, life, faith, society was predicated on the notion that some people were acceptable and some people were not. The way you defined yourself, your identity and place in the world, was by contrasting yourself with others. In Jesus' time, the Jews saw themselves as inherently better and more acceptable to God than non-Jews. In fact, they commonly referred to Gentiles, non-Jews, as dogs, as less than human. They didn't eat with them. They didn't live next door to them. They didn't frequent the same kind of shops or public baths. They even tried to use different roads so that they could limit their exposure to them. The judging didn't stop with the Gentiles. Inside the Jewish community, rich people were seen as more blessed and acceptable to God than poor people. The healthy were seen as righteous, and those with diseases or disabilities were seen as sinners. This went so far that they even constructed an elaborate social hierarchy to determine who was in and who was out, who could worship God in the temple and who could only get into the outside courts. They believed that certain people were inherently more valuable than others, that some were literally subhuman and so could be treated as such. These subhumans were condemned to a life of exclusion from the community and a relationship with God. And this is the kind of judgment that Jesus says is absolutely 100% wrong. When you and I condemn someone, we are declaring that they have no value, no worth, that they don't matter to us or to God. We exclude them from belonging as a way of elevating ourselves. But the problem is that you can't love and judge at the same time. It's impossible to ascribe unsurpassable worth to others when you're using others to ascribe worth to yourself. And that, my friends, is what Jesus is addressing. The idea that your worth, that my worth, requires someone else's condemnation. The idea that the only way to be big and feel good about ourselves is to belittle others. Well, tomorrow is Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and this man, for all of his humanness, and there was a lot of humanness, also had a holiness unlike only a handful of others in the entire religious history of our country. A civil rights leader, a pastor, a preacher, a theologian, a catalyst for justice and peace, and a brilliant interpreter of Jesus' words for us today about judging and condemning and forgiving. I want to read from one of his sermons in which he describes why segregation, a form of exclusion, of judgment, of belittling others, is so wrong. Segregation is not only convenient, that isn't what makes it wrong. Segregation is not only sociologically untenable, that isn't what makes it wrong. Segregation is not only politically and economically unsound, that's not what makes it wrong. Ultimately, segregation is morally wrong and sinful. It's wrong because it substitutes an I-it relationship for an I-thou relationship and relegates persons to the status of things. King reminds us, like Jesus, that judgment causes you and me to see others not as persons, wonderfully and fearfully made by our Creator, but as things, as objects, less than human, less valuable, to be used however and for whatever we want. Once you and I judge a person or a group of people, it opens up the door to all kinds of terrible things like segregation or injustice or prejudice or bullying. You and I may discern another person or group to have a wrong action, but when that discernment causes you and me to value those people or groups less, then we've crossed the line into judgment, condemnation, and exclusion. As I've already pointed out, even among the religious in Jesus' day, this was a common practice. And now, some 2,000 years later, 20-somethings are pointing out the same kind of behavior about religious folk today. The sad statistic is that in 2,000 years, the church hasn't learned how to follow Jesus and his teachings by not judging. Obviously, there are people and groups that you and I may disagree with theologically or socially or politically, but you and I cross that line between discernment and judgment so very easily. You and I quickly devalue or write off those people as less valuable. Crazies, deluded at best, stupid at worst, evil. We exclude them from the status that we feel privileged alone to occupy. And you know what I mean. You've heard Rush Limbaugh, Glenn Beck, Jon Stewart, Stephen Colbert. These are talking heads who speak about those whom they oppose as if they're demonic. Defend your views. Disagree with others, engage on the level of ideas, get a laugh. But when you start to condemn those with whom you disagree, politically or otherwise, when you see them as intrinsically inferior, you're in dangerous territory. I realize these political shows are popular, but I wonder what constant exposure to this kind of rhetoric from either side of the political spectrum does to all of our souls. I wonder how constant exposure might warp our perception of other people and groups. I'd caution us as people of Christ to be on our guard. Is constantly exposing ourselves to this kind of stuff really helping us live as Christ asked us to live? Is it possible that it might be teaching us to judge and condemn in order to evaluate our own sense of worth and to elevate it and make us feel right? When you and I see other people as wrong, not just wrong in what they believe, but in their core identity, it's easy to convince ourselves that we don't have to love them, we don't have to serve them, we don't have to respect them. This exclusion and condemnation of others fuels so much of what is broken in our world today. It's what convinces one group to kill another, one person to abuse another, one person to bully another. I believe that it's at the core of the video that went viral this week of 4 U.S. Marines urinating on the bodies of Taliban soldiers killed in Afghanistan. The Taliban bodies were judged to be, even in death, no longer human, but objects of scorn, derision, and humiliation. Jesus says, not so with you. You and I are never to judge, never to condemn, never to exclude, never to see anyone as without dignity or value, even the person with whom we most vehemently disagree, even with our enemy. Christians are to remind each other that it's our job to agree with God that every person we meet was worth Jesus dying for. And here's the kicker. You and I, we can't ascribe that kind of value and dignity to a person and belittle them at the same time. It's just not possible. There's another side to this issue that we've been discussing. We've talked about those who judge and exclude, but what about those being judged and excluded? What about the victims who've been relegated to subhuman status and are being mistreated by others? Jesus has something important to say to them as well. Consider all of verse 37. Judge not, and you will not be judged. Condemn not, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. When you and I are judged and condemned, we are to forgive. Please understand what that means. If you and I just had the first part about not judging or condemning, we could say that Jesus just wants us to do no harm, to live and let live. We could argue that while we shouldn't exclude anyone, we don't necessarily have to welcome and embrace and live with and connect with them either. But by adding this commandment to forgive, Jesus is calling you and me to something more. As Christ followers, you and I are not just supposed to tolerate people with whom we disagree. We're not just supposed to live and let live. You and I are called to be a people of forgiveness. And forgiveness is a call to actively seek out and reconcile, to stay connected with others. Jesus wants you and me to move away from excluding others and toward embracing them and building with them the beloved community. When you and I find ourselves the victims of wrongdoing, the instinct is always to retaliate, to hate the person or group that's done us wrong. But that just leads to an endless cycle of brokenness and destruction. As Gandhi once famously said, taking an eye for an eye will eventually leave the whole world blind. Jesus says, whether you find yourself in a position to condemn or exclude, or whether you find yourself in a position as a victim, as the people of God, it is your responsibility to end the cycle. You're not to judge, not to condemn, not to exclude. You are to forgive, to heal, to reconcile. And this doesn't mean that you and I don't care about justice or that we don't believe in the consequences for our actions. What it means is that you and I rightfully leave justice and vengeance in God's hands.